He was just walking home when a police officer decided to humiliate him. He didn't know who was in front of him, but what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The heat bore down on the quiet streets of Riverside County like a weight that refused to lift. The late afternoon sun reflected harshly off the windshields of parked cars and scorched the sidewalks into a shimmer of wavering light. Locals moved slowly, with the kind of practiced ease that came from knowing the heat would punish any sudden movement. Children played under sprinklers in narrow yards, and an ice cream truck played a warbled tune as it rolled lazily down Elm Avenue. Chuck Norris stepped out of the small diner on the corner, Sunny Diner, as the sun-bleached sign proclaimed in flaking red letters, and paused for a moment at the edge of the sidewalk. In his right hand he carried a plain paper bag, a sandwich, a bottle of water, and a modest apple. He adjusted his faded cap and glanced around, squinting against the glare. His boots, worn but meticulously kept, struck the concrete with a soft thump as he began to walk. There was nothing about his appearance that screamed notoriety or celebrity. In this town, he was just another quiet man, living out the long, hushed years of retirement in the shadows of a simpler life. He had chosen anonymity. After a life that had once been lived in the spotlight, military service, martial arts championships, television, films, and more, he'd retreated from it all with the steady grace of a man who no longer needed the noise. He spent his mornings training a few neighborhood kids in basic discipline and self-defense, his afternoons reading in the shade of his small backyard, and his evenings walking the same quiet path through downtown for a meal he didn't have to cook himself. It was not a complicated life, and that was precisely how he preferred it. But peace, he had learned, was never permanent. He was approaching the crosswalk when it happened. From the corner of his vision, he noticed the police cruiser pull up abruptly to the curb. The driver's side door swung open with the sort of purposeful aggression that marked a man eager to assert authority. Sergeant Derek Crane stepped out, tall, broad, and white-skinned, with close-cropped blonde hair and the kind of jawline that always looked clenched. His sunglasses reflected the street in mirrored contempt, and his uniform was sharp, almost theatrical in its precision. Chuck kept walking, aware of the presence but giving it no mind. His steps were steady, deliberate. The sergeant, however, had already locked eyes on him. It began with nothing more than a bump, shoulder to shoulder, accidental in passing. "Watch it," Crane barked, his voice too loud for the empty street. Chuck paused and turned slightly. "Didn't mean to," he said simply. Crane took a step forward, closing the space with the entitled posture of someone who had never learned the value of boundaries. "You think you can just run into an officer and walk away?" Chuck didn't reply. He'd been down this road before, years, decades ago in different towns under different circumstances. Some men wore the badge like a responsibility. Others wore it like a weapon. "I asked you a question," Crane said, louder this time, his hand already hovering near his belt. "What's your name?" Chuck turned his face more fully now, the brim of his cap casting a shadow over his eyes. He didn't raise his voice. "Not your business." That was all it took. Crane reached forward, grabbed Chuck's arm roughly, and twisted it behind his back with a practiced, hostile motion. The paper bag dropped to the ground, the apple rolling toward the gutter. Chuck's body leaned forward from the torque, but he did not struggle. His face remained composed, unreadable. He had seen real violence, real cruelty. This wasn't it, not yet. From across the street, a few pedestrians stopped. One woman, dressed in scrubs, froze mid-step outside the clinic. Her name was Kayla James, a registered nurse on her way home after a long shift. She fumbled for her phone, half hiding it in her palm as she began to record. "What exactly are you arresting me for?" Chuck asked quietly. "Resisting," Crane snapped, though nothing of the sort had occurred. "Failure to comply and suspicious behavior." Chuck didn't speak again. The officer shoved him forward, forcing him to his knees. The older man's hands braced instinctively on the concrete, but he remained calm, unmoved. The heat from the pavement seared through his palms, but he didn't flinch. A small crowd had gathered now, nothing major, just a handful of curious onlookers. Someone muttered, "Isn't that—" Crane didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't care. He delivered a sudden, open-handed strike to the back of Chuck's head. The impact rang out like a slap across the whole street. A collective gasp followed. Kayla nearly dropped her phone, her breath catching in her throat. Still, Chuck did not retaliate. "You people think you're above the law," Crane growled, grabbing Chuck by the collar and shoving him sideways so that he landed hard against the side of the cruiser. "Old punks like you think you can mouth off without consequences." Another officer emerged from the cruiser's passenger side, young, hesitant, clearly uncertain. He opened his mouth to speak, but then shut it. There was something about the air, the tension, the imbalance. He didn't want to get involved. Chuck stood slowly, brushing himself off. There was a red mark on his cheek, forming a welt, but he said nothing. His hands remained relaxed at his sides. Crane, panting from the adrenaline of his own outburst, stepped back, suddenly aware of the silence around him. "Get off this street," Crane muttered finally, spitting the words like poison, "before I find a reason to take you in." Chuck retrieved his bag, the apple now bruised and dusty, and walked away without a word. Kayla ended the recording with trembling fingers. The crowd began to disperse. Crane, sneering, returned to his cruiser as if nothing had happened. But something had. That evening, in her modest apartment, Kayla sat on her couch replaying the video over and over. She zoomed in on Chuck's face, on the deliberate way he moved, on the way he didn't fight back. There was something deeply familiar in the stoicism, the grace. She opened a browser window, typed in a name, and stared in disbelief as the images loaded. She scrolled through decades of photographs, articles, interviews, martial arts competitions, military records. There was no doubt. She had just witnessed an attack on Chuck Norris. The realization settled over her like a storm cloud, and with it came a decision. She couldn't let this go. Not this time. Not him. The phone buzzed beside her, a message from her younger brother. "You working tomorrow?" She didn't respond. She stared at the paused frame on her screen. Chuck standing tall, unwavering, even after the slap. Outside, the city simmered under the falling dusk. The streets returned to quiet, but something had shifted, something irreversible. The blow had been public, the footage real, and the legend had been struck. It wouldn't end there. Not with Chuck, and not with Kayla watching. The morning sun broke gently through a thin veil of clouds as Kayla James sat at her modest kitchen table, a chipped mug of coffee cooling in her hands. Her phone lay flat beside her, screen black, but her mind was still reeling from what she had watched the night before. Sleep had been fleeting, her dreams fragmented by echoes of a slap, the thud of a body against a cruiser, and the calm, weathered face of the man who had simply walked away. Chuck Norris. She still couldn't quite believe it. She had spent most of the night researching him. It had started innocently enough, searching his name, confirming her instincts, but as the pages unfolded and the history revealed itself, she became more certain. The man on that street wasn't just some retired old fighter. He was a former serviceman, an American icon, and, more importantly, someone who had spent a lifetime standing against injustice in every form. And he had been assaulted like a common criminal. She had watched the video a dozen times by now. The precision of Chuck's movements, the way he refused to escalate the situation. It wasn't the behavior of someone weak or confused. It was restraint, deliberate and unwavering, the mark of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of and chose peace over dominance. But peace hadn't protected him from the likes of Sergeant Derek Crane. Kayla took another sip of her coffee and finally unlocked her phone. She re-watched the video once more just to make sure. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. The slap, the shove, the complete absence of provocation. She knew that had to mean something. In another world, without the video, the narrative would already be flipped. Crane would claim resistance, belligerence, whatever was necessary to justify his actions, and people would believe him. But this time there was proof. She tapped her screen and composed a short email attaching the video. She had no legal training, no political contacts, but she knew someone who might help, a local investigative journalist named Jason Winters. He wasn't mainstream, but he had a reputation. He'd written about police overreach before, small-time corruption, especially in these quieter counties where oversight was lax and stories rarely left the city limits. She had read one of his pieces a year ago about a missing body cam from a domestic dispute. He didn't have the loudest platform, but he had integrity. She hit send. Then she sat back, staring at the screen, her heart pounding. She had just stepped into something she couldn't undo. Later that afternoon, Kayla put on her scrubs and headed toward the hospital. She hadn't told anyone what she had seen, not even her closest friend on the staff. Part of her feared retaliation. Another part feared that no one would believe her. But mostly, she feared nothing would happen at all, that even with evidence, even with clarity, the system would close ranks around its own and silence her with procedure. As she crossed the parking lot, her phone vibrated. She pulled it out. Jason had replied, "Can we talk? This is serious. Meet tonight?" She responded with a simple yes and gave him the address of a nearby cafe she trusted. Quiet, no cameras, and frequented by night nurses and medical staff. When they met that evening, Jason wore a dark hoodie and glasses, his face weary from a life of digging where others chose to look away. He didn't shake hands. Instead, he pulled out a tablet and pressed play on the video she had sent. They sat in silence as the footage played out once again. When it ended, Jason stared at the screen for a long moment before speaking. "This isn't just bad," he said finally. "It's a case." Kayla nodded. "That's Chuck Norris." Jason glanced up sharply. "You're sure?" "I looked it up. It's him." Jason scrubbed a hand across his jaw. "If this goes public, it won't just be about a cop getting physical with an old man. This is going to explode." "Good," Kayla said quietly. "It should." Jason asked her for permission to publish it, with anonymity if she preferred. She hesitated, but only for a moment. "No. If they want to come for me, let them. But I'm not hiding." Jason nodded slowly. "All right. Then we go carefully. I'll reach out to a few trusted sources. If we do this right, it'll be impossible to bury." They agreed to wait 2 days, enough time to gather context, statements, and ensure they had a legal buffer. Kayla walked home under the weight of a decision she couldn't take back. But something in her chest felt lighter than it had in years. The next day, she went to the police station. She carried a copy of the video on a flash drive, intending to file an official complaint. At the front desk, she asked to speak with the duty sergeant. The man behind the desk, bored, thick-necked, uninterested, narrowed his eyes when she explained what the complaint involved. He asked her to wait. After 20 minutes, she was led into a back room and told to sit. Another officer joined her, older, in plain clothes, identifying himself as an internal review liaison. He asked for her statement. She provided it. She handed over the flash drive. His face changed when he inserted it into his laptop and watched the footage. He closed the screen abruptly and leaned forward. "You understand, Miss James," he said, "that making false accusations against law enforcement is a serious offense." Her heart thudded. "It's not false. We'll look into it," he said coldly, "but I strongly suggest you think carefully about repeating any of this outside this room. Allegations like these, they have consequences." She stood. "For whom?" He didn't answer. She left the station with her breath short, her hands shaking. She had just walked into the lion's den and left her scent behind. That night, she found a plain white envelope taped to her front door. Inside was a blank sheet of paper, except for one sentence typed neatly in the center. "You're playing with fire." She stared at it for a long time. Then she lit a match, burned the paper over her kitchen sink, and flushed the ashes. The following afternoon, she went back to the community center where she had first seen Chuck Norris. It took some asking around, but eventually she found out where he spent his mornings, an old gym tucked behind a strip mall, easy to miss unless you knew where to look. She waited until the youth classes ended. Then she approached him. He was wiping down the mats when she stepped inside. For a moment, she didn't recognize him out of context. No hat, no shadows, just a man with gray at his temples and a tired, deliberate grace in his movements. But when he turned, their eyes met, and the weight of everything she had seen came rushing back. "I know who you are," she said quietly. He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. "I have the video," she continued. "The world saw what he did to you." He exhaled slowly. "Then you should delete it." "I won't." He nodded once, as if he had expected that. Then he resumed wiping the mats. "I sent it to a journalist," she said. "It's going to come out." He paused, straightened, and looked at her fully. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear either, just a quiet sadness. "Why now?" he asked. "Because I've seen too many people get hurt. Because I've watched silence protect the worst among us. And because if someone like you won't stand up, then who will?" He didn't respond. Not right away. She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "What's your name?" "Kayla." He gave her a small, solemn nod. She walked out into the twilight with no idea whether she had just made an ally or stirred an old warrior back into the storm. But she knew something had shifted. She had passed him the torch, and from this point on, the silence would fight back. The next morning began the same as every other. The sun pushed its pale light through the blinds of Chuck Norris's modest home, painting long slats across the wooden floor. A kettle whistled on the stove, birds chirped beyond the porch, but inside something had changed. Chuck stood barefoot in the kitchen, his mug cooling in his hand. On the table beside him lay Kayla's business card, placed there the night before after she'd walked away without asking for anything in return. She hadn't begged, hadn't insisted. She had simply told the truth and left him with it. That truth now burned quietly in his chest, not as rage, but as a kind of clarity he hadn't felt in years. He walked into the den, turned on the TV, and flipped through the local channels. No mention of the incident. No mention of Crane. Of course not. The station knew exactly how to bury things that were inconvenient. Still, the silence stung, not because he needed the recognition — he had long stopped caring about such things — but because it confirmed what Kayla had feared. The system wasn't just failing, it was actively suppressing justice. He returned to the table and replayed the video Jason had sent him overnight. It had made its way through encrypted platforms already. A small audience of truth seekers had seen it. Reactions varied, from disbelief to fury. Some questioned whether it was really him in the footage. Others insisted it was doctored. But those who recognized him, who knew the way he moved, the discipline behind the restraint, understood. Still, it wasn't enough. Not yet. Chuck slid his phone from his pocket and began scrolling through names he hadn't contacted in years. Some were crossed out, dead, moved on, disappeared, but there were a few who might still answer his call. He made the first one before sunrise. An hour later, he sat in a quiet booth at a truck stop diner on the edge of town, across from a man who once served under his command during an overseas joint task force. Jorge Ramirez, now grayer, rounder, and running a security firm near the border, hadn't lost his memory or his loyalty. "It's true?" Jorge asked, flipping his phone to show the video paused at the slap. Chuck nodded. "You just let him hit you?" I chose not to respond. Jorge shook his head. "That's what scares them. You don't flinch." Chuck leaned forward. "I need to know who covers for guys like Crane." Jorge frowned, lowering his voice. "There's chatter, sure, even in private networks. They call themselves different things in different counties. Response units, rapid teams, even ghost squads. But the same names come up. Internal shields, quiet backers. These aren't rogue guys, they're being directed." "From where?" "That's the hard part. The protection is layered, complaints disappear, Iowa files go missing. If you want names, you need someone on the inside willing to risk their neck." Chuck took a long sip of his coffee. "Then I'll find them." Later that day, back in Riverside, Kayla was leaving her shift at the hospital when she noticed the same white sedan parked across the street as the day before. It wasn't anyone she recognized. The windows were tinted, and it hadn't moved in hours. She pretended not to notice, but the weight of its presence clung to her all the way home. Inside, she drew the blinds and double-checked the locks. When her phone buzzed, she jumped. It was a text from Jason. "Trouble. Got flagged. File disappearing from uploads. Need backup storage." She replied with a link to her own cloud backup and another message. "They're watching me too." Jason responded within seconds. "Stay low. I've seen this pattern before. They escalate." That night, as darkness wrapped the neighborhood in silence, Chuck made his second call. This time it was to an old contact in law enforcement, Detective Lorna Bell, retired LAPD, who had left the department after exposing a falsified evidence ring. She had always been the kind who chose conscience over career, and he had trained with her decades ago in a mixed agency tactical group. She met him the next morning in an empty community center gym. "You sure you want to stir this again?" she asked as she locked the door behind them. "I didn't stir it, they did." She watched the video in silence. Her face hardened. "I know that cop. Crane. He bounced through 3 precincts in 5 years. Internal Affairs opened a file once. Disappeared. Where does he report now?" "Technically, he's under the West County Special Enforcement Detail, But unofficially, he's part of something dirtier. They call it SCOPE around here, Selective Control and Operations Enforcement. It's not listed anywhere, no funding trail, but they're active. Chuck raised an eyebrow. And protected. Deeply. Lorna slid a thin folder across the table. Inside were scans of redacted memos, clipped emails, and 2 witness statements that had never made it into official records. One was from a woman who claimed Crane had used excessive force during a wellness check. The other was from a former rookie who'd quit the force after 1 year. They warned him to shut up. His file vanished after he left. Where is he now? Last I heard, teaching self-defense classes outside Barstow. Lives off the grid. Name's Corey Langston. Chuck nodded. I'll find him. Meanwhile, Crane had not been idle. Word had reached him that the footage existed, and though he hadn't been named in any public release yet, he sensed the pressure building. His commanding officer had called him in for a routine review, but the tone was off. Colder. Less protective. He drove to Kayla's street that evening, parking further down this time behind a black SUV. He watched her lights. He watched her shadow move across the curtain. He waited. When she stepped outside to take out the trash, he moved. She didn't see him approach, not until he was already speaking. You should have kept your phone in your pocket, sweetheart. She froze. What do you want? Respect, silence, same thing. She reached for her pocket, but he grabbed her wrist before she could tap her screen. That was the moment he felt a presence behind him. A hand gripped his shoulder, not harshly, but with the kind of pressure that made a man freeze before his instincts caught up. You really want to do this? Chuck said softly. Crane turned, startled. He barely had time to register the face before his wrist was released from Kayla's grip and his own arm was twisted behind his back. Not hard, not violent, but final. Chuck looked him in the eyes. Walk away or fall down. Crane stepped back, shaken. You've got no idea who you're messing with. I know enough. Crane retreated to his car, the threat unspoken but heavy. Kayla stood silent for a moment, then exhaled. I didn't think you'd come. Chuck looked toward the street, then back at her. I'm here now. The next morning, Jason published the first full article. Names were withheld, but the footage was included in full. He included excerpts from the redacted memos Lorna had given them, paired with witness statements from people like Kayla who refused to be silenced. The story caught fire. National bloggers picked it up. Advocacy groups began tweeting the footage. Within hours, the mayor's office released a statement promising an independent review. The Riverside Police Department issued a contradictory memo calling the video inconclusive. But the people had seen enough. At a community meeting the next evening, dozens of citizens showed up demanding answers. Local TV stations arrived, protest signs emerged, and somewhere in a dark conference room downtown, senior officials stared at a screen showing Chuck Norris's face frozen mid-frame. We need to handle this, one of them muttered. But Chuck was already moving. He knew now what Crane represented, and he knew there were others. It wasn't just about a slap on a sidewalk anymore. It was about the system that taught men like Derek Crane that they could strike with impunity. And that was a fight Chuck had prepared for his entire life. The rain came without warning. A rare phenomenon for Riverside County, but that morning the sky opened like a reckoning. Heavy drops struck the windows of the gym as Chuck stood alone near the entrance, arms crossed, watching the parking lot darken under the assault. There was something poetic about it, he thought, like the land itself was trying to wash away what had festered too long in silence. and silence had never been more dangerous than now. It had been 48 hours since Jason's article dropped. 48 hours of chaos. The footage had gone viral, as they'd hoped. Not just the brief clip of the assault, but also snippets of Chuck walking away, battered but composed. The redacted documents, paired with statements from witnesses like Kayla, formed a pattern that no amount of official backpedaling could fully erase. The public didn't need all the names anymore. They had seen enough to recognize injustice. Yet the system responded as it always did, first with deflection, then with denial. The mayor's office released a second statement distancing itself from the police department's actions. The chief of police offered condolences to the community but insisted no malicious misconduct had occurred. And Derek Crane? He had gone conspicuously silent, his patrol assignments suddenly reassigned, his presence conspicuously absent from the streets. Rumors swirled. Some said he had been suspended. Others whispered he was being protected, kept from public view until things cooled down. Chuck knew better. The night before, he had driven alone to a warehouse near the industrial outskirts of the city, following a lead Lorna had provided him. Inside, he met with a former technician who once worked within the department's digital infrastructure. The man, jittery and reeking of fear, confirmed what Chuck had suspected. Body cam footage from multiple incidents involving Crane had been either edited or entirely deleted. The files were logged but corrupted, replaced with placeholders that made investigation nearly impossible. Someone higher up had covered his tracks, and it wasn't just Crane. That morning, Chuck and Kayla sat in the back of the community center, reviewing the growing archive of statements they'd received. Dozens now, people from different neighborhoods, backgrounds, all echoing the same themes: intimidation, force, silence. Jason joined them, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "They're pushing back harder than I thought," he said, rubbing his temples. "Every upload I post gets hit with flags. They're even trying to subpoena my servers." Kayla folded her arms. "So they're scared." Jason looked at Chuck. "Scared of you, more than anything." Chuck didn't answer right away. He looked down at a photograph someone had emailed, an image of a battered apartment door with a caption, "He said he'd come back if I spoke to anyone again." Kayla leaned over. "That's from a woman in Jefferson Heights. She tried to file a report 2 years ago. Guess who the officer was?" Chuck nodded slowly. "Crane." Jason tapped his pen against the table. "We need to go further. They won't cave from pressure alone." "I know," Chuck said. "It's time to show them everything." That afternoon they prepared the full release. Not just the video, not just the testimonies, but the internal communications Chuck had collected from the ex-technician, the statement from the rookie who had disappeared after witnessing Crane assault a teenager, and the audio clip Lorna had secured of a lieutenant boasting that certain officers don't answer to paperwork. By sundown, the video package was ready. Jason hit publish. Within an hour, major news outlets picked it up. Then national ones. Then international. A CNN segment ran a blurred clip of Chuck standing firm against Crane's aggression, followed by expert commentary dissecting his non-response as the ultimate civilian discipline. Social media erupted. Hashtags flooded in support. #Stand with Chuck. #End the Shield. #Crane exposed. But the most powerful moment came when Kayla, standing at the steps of the city courthouse, addressed a crowd of 200 under flickering streetlights. "He didn't hit back," she said into the microphone. "He didn't raise a fist. He raised a standard." Cheers followed, then chants, The energy swelled like a rising tide. Behind her, Chuck remained silent, arms folded, eyes scanning the crowd, not for applause but for danger. He had seen too many movements derailed by distraction. Later that night, back at the gym, Chuck received a call from Lorna. They just issued a warrant. For what? Crane, officially. Use of force, destruction of evidence, intimidation of witnesses. Chuck exhaled. It's beginning. But the victory was short-lived. The following morning, while Kayla was on her way to work, 2 unmarked vehicles began tailing her down the interstate. She noticed them only after the 3rd exit. They didn't flash lights or make contact, but they didn't turn away either. She took the long route to the hospital, parked in a lot with cameras, and rushed inside. Jason, too, reported his laptop being accessed remotely. He'd gone dark, using only burner phones and secured drives. Chuck knew the retaliation was coming. He sat in his kitchen, watching the rain resume, and waited. The doorbell rang. When he opened it, a man stood there, tall, built like a linebacker, dressed in plain clothes but with the rigid posture of someone military-trained. "Mr. Norris," he said, "my name's Thomas Green. I was a cadet under you years ago at Quantico. You probably don't remember me." Chuck studied him. "I remember discipline, not faces." Green smiled faintly. "I've been watching. You've stirred something they can't control. You still in?" "I'm out now, but I know who's still pulling the strings. I want to help." Chuck let him in. They talked for hours. Green revealed that the unit Crane belonged to, Scope, was more than a nickname. It was a compartmentalized program designed for proactive civilian control in high-risk zones. Officers were selected for their aggression, not their discretion. They were trained separately, documented loosely, and often deployed under alternate titles. They reported not just to local captains but to a regional coordinator operating from a private consulting group that technically didn't exist on public ledgers. "You want to take them down," Green said. "You need someone from the inside to say it all, on record." Chuck nodded. "Then find them." Over the next 3 days, they tracked down 2 former Scope members. One refused to speak. The other, a woman named Ray Patel, agreed to an off-camera interview. Her voice trembling, she described how she was assigned to fabricate reports, plant traces of narcotics during stops, and redirect complaints to a review board that was, in fact, a group of internal officers trained to destroy documentation. Chuck sat in silence as she spoke. Kayla held her hand as she cried. When the interview ended, Chuck rose. "Tomorrow," he said, "we go public again. This time they don't get to deny." And they did. The next day, Jason coordinated a live stream hosted by an independent network. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't corporate, but it reached millions. Chuck appeared on screen, seated at a plane table, his face lit only by natural light. No scripts, no rehearsals. "I've spent my life preparing people to defend themselves," he said. "And right now, this country needs to defend itself from something worse than any criminal. From those who wear power like armor and swing it like a weapon." The video exploded. More testimonies poured in. Then the first resignation came. A senior deputy chief in Riverside's Western Division. Then another. Then a full city council meeting was called, streamed live, where Kayla stood at the microphone again, this time not just as a nurse but as a citizen with a voice. "We let this happen," she said, "by closing our eyes, by saying it's someone else's fight. But now it's our fight, and it's not over." As the meeting concluded, someone slipped Chuck a sealed manila envelope. Inside was a single sheet, a court date. Crane was being formally arraigned, and Chuck Norris had been summoned to testify as the primary witness. He folded the paper slowly. Outside, the rain finally stopped, but a different kind of storm had just begun. The courthouse steps were slick with morning dew when Chuck Norris arrived, his boots clicking steadily against the concrete. The city had changed since the incident, since the first video went live, since Kayla stood before a crowd with truth trembling in her voice and strength in her eyes. Now, the courthouse was surrounded by reporters, activists, citizens carrying signs, and plainclothes officers stationed discreetly among the crowd. The mood was no longer uncertain. It was charged with expectation. Justice, for once, didn't feel like an abstract word. It felt imminent. Chuck moved through the crowd without speaking, nodding only once toward a familiar face. Jason, standing off to the side, camera gear in hand, sweat on his brow, but resolve in his stance. Kayla was already inside, dressed in a dark blazer, seated in the witness room with Lorna beside her. The prosecution had advised them both to keep low profiles, but there was no hiding anymore. Their faces had already become symbols in a city struggling to redefine its relationship with truth. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with restrained tension. The press had been limited to one corner. No cameras allowed, but sketch artists were already moving their pencils in frantic strokes. Chuck took his seat near the front, his posture straight, hands folded in his lap. The man sitting across from him at the defense table didn't look like the dominant figure he had met on the street that day. Derek Crane looked smaller now, his shoulders hunched under a navy suit 2 sizes too big, his expression pinched and pale. Gone was the swagger, the bark, the open threat. But Chuck didn't mistake the silence for repentance. It was calculation, the predator's patience. The judge entered promptly, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes known for her no-nonsense demeanor. As the court came to order, the first statements were made. The prosecution painted the picture swiftly. An officer, known for excessive force, caught on camera, supported by a growing body of evidence implicating him in a web of intimidation, falsified reports, and violence. The defense tried to counter by attacking the credibility of the footage, citing context, claiming the video lacked audio, lacked the full story. They argued that Crane had followed protocol under perceived threat, that the man he assaulted hadn't identified himself, hadn't complied. Chuck was called to the stand before lunch. He rose slowly and walked to the witness box. The courtroom watched in silence. He took the oath without pause, his voice steady. The prosecutor began with simple questions: his name, his background, his role in the incident. Chuck answered with minimal words, never embellishing, never wavering. Then came the footage, played in full. Everyone watched as Crane barked his questions, struck Chuck across the face, shoved him. The volume in the room lowered, as if the oxygen itself recoiled from the violence on screen. The prosecutor turned back to Chuck. "Mr. Norris, why didn't you respond?" Chuck looked at her, then at the jury. "Because if I had, they wouldn't be watching this in a courtroom. They'd be watching it in a morgue." A few murmurs rippled through the benches. The judge banged her gavel lightly. "And what was your intention during the encounter?" "To walk away, to de-escalate, to give the system a chance to work." The prosecutor nodded. "Do you believe the system worked?" Chuck's eyes moved to Crane, then back. "Not yet." The defense cross-examined next. The attorney, young and full of manufactured politeness, tried to spin the narrative. "Mr. Norris, would you say you're an intimidating presence?" "Not unless I choose to be." "And isn't it possible that Officer Crane felt threatened by your posture, your size, your silence?" Chuck tilted his head slightly. If a man feels threatened by silence, he's not a man who should wear a badge. The attorney shifted, clearly thrown. You didn't identify yourself. Do you regret not de-escalating sooner? I didn't see a reason to explain who I was, Chuck answered. And I did de-escalate. I didn't fight back. I didn't retaliate. I chose peace. He chose violence. There was no further need for questions. Chuck stepped down from the stand and returned to his seat, the room still steeped in the gravity of his words. Kayla testified next. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she described what she saw. She spoke of Crane's expression, of Chuck's calm, of the sound the slap made and the way it silenced the street. She told them how she'd taken the video, how the police tried to dissuade her, how she received threats, and how she made the decision not to back down. They told me to be quiet, she said, eyes on the jury. They made me feel like I was doing something wrong, but it was him, and no one stopped him until someone stood up. When she stepped down, there were no claps, no cheers, just a stillness that said everything. The trial lasted a week. Each day, more evidence emerged. Documents Jason had uncovered, whistleblower statements authenticated by federal analysts, internal memos showing deliberate tampering of reports. By the third day, public pressure had swelled so high that the police department announced a full internal audit. By the fifth, a second officer linked to Crane had resigned under investigation. And by the end of the sixth, the jury returned a unanimous verdict. Guilty on all counts. Crane was sentenced to 15 years without the possibility of parole for the first 10. As he was led out of the courtroom, he passed Chuck, their eyes meeting for a single breath. There was no gloating in Chuck's gaze, no triumph, only quiet resolve. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. People clapped as Kayla exited, reporters shouted questions at Jason, and members of advocacy groups shook hands and passed flyers. But Chuck remained inside a moment longer, seated in the now empty room, his thoughts distant. Lorna approached quietly and sat beside him. "It's done," she said. Chuck shook his head. "Not yet. What more could you want? Accountability isn't justice. It's only the beginning." She studied him. "You're not planning on walking away, are you?" Chuck looked out the window where the last of the clouds were breaking apart and blue sky crept in. "No," he said, "not this time." That evening, at the community center gym, a small ceremony was held. Not for show, not for politics, just a gathering of those who had stood together. Kayla was presented with a plaque recognizing her courage. Jason received a medal from a grassroots coalition. Lorna gave a speech about truth and sacrifice. And Chuck? He stood before the young students who trained under him each week, all seated in a circle, their eyes wide. "You're going to be told that strength is power," he said, "but real strength is responsibility. It's not in how hard you hit, but how hard you can choose not to. That's where power lives." They listened in silence. Afterwards, as the guests trickled out and the night settled in, Chuck stood alone outside the gym. A cool breeze swept across the lot. Taped to the front door, just above the handle, was a folded piece of paper. He pulled it off, unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the message simple. "You didn't just fight for us. You reminded us we were worth the fight." Chuck stared at the note for a long time, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He stepped back inside the gym. There would be other battles, always, other wrongs to face. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, something real had been won, And that, he knew, was worth the weight of every quiet sacrifice. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the next video. We're just getting started. And if you believe others need to see this, share it.